Imagine standing at the edge of a forest unlike anything you have ever seen. The trees around you look strange, their trunks rough and scaled, their canopies thick and alien. The air feels heavier, richer, almost thick enough to taste, and the insects here are not small. One flies past with a wingspan wider than your outstretched arms. Another crawls across the forest floor, a giant millipede nearly 2.5 meters long. It sounds like a nightmare, but this place was real. Hundreds of millions of years ago, long before the first dinosaur ever lived, Earth was already covered in forests like this. Forests filled with creatures so strange that even today scientists look at the fossils and pause. Most people think of dinosaurs when they imagine prehistoric life. But the truth is, the age before dinosaurs lasted even longer than the age of dinosaurs itself, and it produced some of the most extraordinary worlds our planet has ever seen. This is the story of Earth before the dinosaurs, a time of giant insects, alien forests, and creatures that ruled the planet long before the famous giants ever appeared. To understand the creatures that lived in the era before dinosaurs, you first have to understand the world they lived in, and that world, by any measure, was profoundly different from the one we inhabit today. If you could somehow find yourself in orbit above the Earth 350 million years ago, the planet below you would look almost completely alien. The coastlines you know, the familiar silhouettes of Africa and South America, the broken puzzle edge of Antarctica, the jagged shores of Asia, none of those would exist. Instead, you would see a single, vast, continuous landmass. One supercontinent so enormous it spanned the planet from pole to pole. Scientists call it Pangaea, from the ancient Greek meaning all lands, and even that name feels inadequate for the sheer scale of what it represented. Pangaea was not a fixed, stable thing. It had formed over hundreds of millions of years of slow continental collision, the great tectonic plates of the Earth gradually grinding toward one another, building mountain ranges along the lines where they met, reshaping the interior climates of entire regions in the process. By the time the Carboniferous Period was underway, roughly 350 to 300 million years ago, Pangaea was fully assembled, a single great landmass washing between two vast ocean systems. The largest of those oceans was the Panthalassa. Its name means all seas, and the name fits. This ocean covered more than half the surface of the planet. Its waters stretched uninterrupted across the globe, hosting currents of immense scale and depth, patterns of circulation that had no modern equivalent. Along the eastern shore of Pangaea, two other bodies of water existed, the Tethys and the Paleotethys, ancient oceans whose floors have long since been swallowed back into the planet's mantle. The tectonic processes that drive plate movement recycle oceanic crust far faster than continental crust, which means that the rock that once formed the floor of those great seas no longer exists in any recognizable form. Only the deepest and oldest portions of the Pacific Ocean today carry any geological memory of the Panthalassa's waters. Standing on the surface of this ancient planet, the first thing you would notice is the smell. There was no clean modern air, no crisp northern pine scent, no salt and seaweed tang of modern coastlines. The atmosphere itself was chemically different. The ratio of gases in the air fluctuated dramatically throughout this period, swinging between compositions that would have been mildly disorienting and compositions that would have been genuinely significant in their effect on living tissue. Oxygen levels in particular, the gas that governs how large animals can grow, how active they can be, how intensely their muscles can fire, reached concentrations measurably higher than the 21% we breathe today. At certain points during the Carboniferous, oxygen may have comprised as much as 30 to 35% of the atmosphere. The implications of that single fact cascade outward in surprising directions, and we will return to them shortly. The climate of Pangaea during this period was broadly what scientists describe as sharply continental. Because so much of the landmass was distant from any ocean, vast interior regions received little moisture. Cold, dry winters alternated with hot, dry summers. The equatorial zones, watered by moisture from the encircling seas, supported forests of staggering density and strangeness. But move inland, and the land became rocky, barren, largely lifeless. A geography more reminiscent of a modern desert plateau than anything we tend to associate with the lush imagery of ancient life. Along the equatorial belt, however, life had taken extraordinary hold. The forests that grew there were not forests in any sense that a modern botanist would immediately recognise. Flowering plants did not yet exist. Grasses did not exist. The broad canopy trees with their wide leaves and their fruit-bearing branches were hundreds of millions of years in the future. Instead, the Carboniferous forests were built from species that today exist only as distant, diminished echoes of their former selves. Tree ferns, giant horsetails, lycopsid trees, sometimes called club mosses, plants whose biology had been fine-tuned for a wet, hot, oxygen-rich environment that would vanish long before any mammal ever evolved. Some of these lycopsid trees reached heights of 40 metres. Their trunks grew to a metre or more in diameter. Their bark was marked with the distinctive diamond-shaped scars left behind by fallen leaves, a pattern so distinctive that paleobotanists can identify individual species from fragments of fossilised bark alone. In the canopy above, species of tree ferns spread their fronds outward in layered spirals, filtering the pale carboniferous light. Along the ground, the slow accumulation of fallen vegetation had begun a process that would shape human civilization hundreds of millions of years later. The bacteria and fungi that today break down dead plant matter had not yet evolved the biochemical tools to decompose lignin, the tough structural polymer that gives wood its rigidity. When a tree fell in a Carboniferous forest, it stayed fallen. It accumulated. Layer upon layer of organic material built up in the wet, low-oxygen swamps along the equatorial coast, slowly compressed, slowly transformed, stripped of its water and its nitrogen, reduced over geological time to dense black carbon. Coal. The same coal that powered the Industrial Revolution. The same coal whose combustion we are still grappling with today. The Carboniferous period is named for precisely this process, the formation of coal, and it is one of the stranger ironies of geological history that the era of giant insects and alien forests left behind the fuel that would define the modern world. But perhaps even stranger is what the coal-forming process did to the atmosphere while it was happening. Every tree trunk that fell and failed to decompose was a tree trunk that had removed carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis and then simply kept it, sequestered it, locked it away from the carbon cycle. Over millions of years, as forests accumulated and their dead matter piled up rather than rotting back into carbon dioxide, the concentration of that gas in the atmosphere gradually fell, and as carbon dioxide fell, the oxygen released by those same forests during photosynthesis accumulated, with no decomposition process consuming it back again. The result was an oxygen peak that has no real parallel in Earth's subsequent history, and it produced, among other things, some of the most spectacular animals that have ever lived. The question of why insects in the Carboniferous grew to such enormous sizes has occupied scientists for more than a century. When the first fossil wings of Meganeura were discovered in France in the 1880s, the sheer scale of the specimen provoked both astonishment and immediate skepticism. A wingspan of over 70 centimetres. An animal built on the same basic plan as a modern dragonfly, but occupying a completely different position in the food web. Massive, predatory, hunting through the warm equatorial air of a world that no longer exists. The oxygen hypothesis is the most widely accepted explanation, though it is important to understand what it actually proposes and what it does not. Insects breathe through a system of tubes called tracheae, which deliver oxygen directly to the tissues that need it. There is no blood-based oxygen transport the way mammals rely on hemoglobin. The tracheal system works beautifully at small scales, but it has physical limits. As an insect grows larger, the tubes have to grow longer and wider to deliver adequate oxygen to the tissues at the far ends of the body. At some point, the mass of the tracheal system itself becomes so large relative to the insect's total body that further growth becomes mechanically impossible. The insect simply cannot support the overhead cost of its own breathing apparatus. Raise the ambient oxygen concentration though, and that limit shifts. With 30% oxygen rather than 21, the gradient that drives oxygen into the tracheal system is steeper. Delivery is more efficient. The tubes can be longer for the same effective delivery rate. The body can be larger. The physical ceiling on insect body size rises considerably. There is also a secondary pressure at work. The Carboniferous was a period in which vertebrates, the lineage that would eventually produce amphibians, reptiles, mammals and birds, were only just beginning to establish themselves on land. The first tetrapods had crawled out of the water barely tens of millions of years earlier, and they remained small, relatively slow, and largely confined to the water's edge. For a flying animal in the Carboniferous, the skies were essentially unchallenged territory. There were no birds, there were no flying reptiles, there was nothing in the air that could catch a large, fast-moving insect predator. Meganeura and its closely related relatives in the genus Meganeura lived in that open sky as genuine apex predators of the aerial environment. Their fossils suggest animals built for bursts of speed and precision. The large compound eyes would have given excellent visual resolution across a wide field of view, well suited to tracking moving prey. The spines on the legs formed an effective grasping basket, the same basic trap architecture seen in modern dragonflies, where the legs are positioned during flight to scoop prey from the air with devastating effectiveness. Modern dragonflies, for all their apparent delicacy, are among the most successful aerial hunters in the insect world. Studies tracking their hunting success in controlled environments have found capture rates exceeding 90%, a figure that compares favourably to any predator on the planet. Meganeura, with its larger body and presumably similar sensory apparatus, was likely operating by a very similar strategy: watching, calculating, committing suddenly, executing with precision. What Meganeura actually hunted is not entirely clear from the fossil record, but the Carboniferous skies were not empty. Smaller insects existed in enormous variety and abundance. Primitive relatives of modern cockroaches were among the most common animals on land. Various flying insects whose exact relationships to modern groups remain debated also populated the equatorial forests. A predator the size of Meganeura had no shortage of prey. Some researchers have proposed that Meganeura may also have taken small vertebrates. This is speculative, but not unreasonable. The early amphibians of the Carboniferous were often small, slow creatures, and the grasping legs of a large Meganeura would have been more than adequate to seize and hold a small tetrapod. Whether this actually happened is something the fossil record cannot definitively answer. What the fossils do suggest is that Meganeura was not simply a scaled-up version of a modern dragonfly. Thermal modelling of its physiology indicates that the insect faced significant heat management challenges. A body of that size generating metabolic heat during flight, in an already warm Carboniferous climate, would have needed to dissipate that heat efficiently. The current thinking is that Meganeura probably flew in short, intense bursts rather than the sustained soaring or hovering that some modern dragonflies employ. Hunt fast, strike fast, perch, recover. There is also evidence suggesting that the respiratory system of some Carboniferous giant insects was more elaborate than the passive tracheal tubes of their smaller modern relatives. Some researchers have proposed that these animals may have used a form of active ventilation, muscular pumping of air through the tracheal system, similar to what some large modern insects, including certain large beetles and hawk moths, employ during intense activity. If this is correct, it further supports the idea that giant Carboniferous insects were not simply passive beneficiaries of a high-oxygen world, but animals whose physiology had been actively shaped by selection for large body size and energetically demanding predatory lifestyles. The end of Meganeura came not with a sudden catastrophe, but with a gradual shift in the conditions that had allowed it to flourish. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian period, oxygen levels began their long decline back toward modern values. The great coal-forming swamp forests retreated as the climate dried, and the vertebrates, those once modest creatures lurking at the water's edge, were evolving rapidly, producing larger, more active forms that could compete with giant insects for resources, and eventually hunt them. The skies would belong to insects for millions of years yet, but never again, in all the long subsequent history of the planet, would anything quite like Meganeura take to the air. While Meganeura commanded the skies of the Carboniferous world, the forest floor belonged to something even more striking in its sheer physical presence. Arthropleura was a millipede. This statement, delivered without context, does not adequately prepare you for what it actually was. A modern millipede is an inconspicuous creature, an animal you might find in your garden, coiled under a stone, perhaps 15 centimeters long if it is a large one. The encounter is mildly interesting and quickly forgotten. Arthropleura was approximately 2.5 meters long and up to 50 centimeters wide. Its weight has been estimated based on careful modelling of its body plan and the density of its exoskeleton at somewhere between 50 and 100 kilograms. It was not merely the largest land invertebrate in the history of the planet as currently known, it was larger than most of the vertebrates that shared its environment. It moved through the Carboniferous undergrowth with dozens of legs working in slow, rolling coordination, its body close to the ground, its segmented mass covering the leaf litter like a living carpet. Finding it would have been almost impossible to miss. The first Arthropleura fossils were described in the 19th century, but for a long time the animal remained poorly understood, partly because truly complete specimens are rare. Arthropleura, like other arthropods, molted, periodically shedding its exoskeleton as it grew, and many of the fossil finds are shed skins rather than whole animals. This creates interpretive challenges. A shed exoskeleton tells you about the shape of the body, but not always about the internal anatomy, the musculature, or the detailed behaviour of the living animal. What has proven enormously revealing, however, is the trackways. Arthropleura trackways are known from several sites across what is now North America and Europe, and it is important to remember that these sites were part of the equatorial zone of Pangaea during the Carboniferous, positioned roughly where the tropical forests were richest. The trackways are unmistakable, parallel rows of impressions pressed into ancient mud or sand, sometimes covering several meters, showing the characteristic gait of a very large, very heavy animal moving with slow deliberation. Analysis of these trackways has allowed researchers to study aspects of Arthropleura's movement that the fossils alone could never reveal. The spacing and depth of the impressions tell you about gait speed. The way the impressions are arranged relative to one another tells you something about how the animal distributed its weight across its many legs. The surface on which the tracks were made, typically soft, damp substrate near water, tells you something about the environments this animal preferred. The picture that emerges is of a slow-moving, ground-hugging herbivore, or at least an animal with a strongly omnivorous or detritivorous diet. The mandibles, the mouthparts, are not the heavy, powerful crushing tools you would expect from an active predator. They are relatively modest, suitable for processing softer plant material, fungi, decaying organic matter, perhaps soft-bodied invertebrates when the opportunity arose. The absence of any obvious venom delivery system further reinforces the non-predatory interpretation. Arthropleura was an animal that simply ate what was abundantly available in the Carboniferous forest, and what was abundantly available was an enormous quantity of plant material, ranging from living ferns and leucopsid needles to decaying logs and leaf litter. In an ecosystem where bacteria had not yet learned to efficiently break down lignin, the forest floor was essentially a continuous feast of slowly decomposing organic material. Arthropleura may have played a role in that decomposition, physically breaking down large plant fragments into smaller pieces that soil microbes could then process more effectively. Some researchers have proposed that Arthropleura went through phases of its life cycle, during which it was aquatic, or at least semi-aquatic. This hypothesis rests on the distribution of fossil sites, many of which are in low-lying coastal or riparian environments, and on the basic biology of molting. When an arthropod sheds its exoskeleton, there is a window of hours to days during which the new exoskeleton is still hardening, and the animal is temporarily vulnerable. Its own body weight can work against it if its legs, now soft and unbraced, cannot support the mass above them. For an animal as large as Arthropleura, this vulnerability period would have been significant. Water provides buoyancy that partially relieves the load on the legs. It is conceivable that these animals retreated to shallow water during molting, waiting for their new armour to harden before venturing back onto land. There is also the possibility of sheltering in hollow trunks. The giant lycopsid trees of the Carboniferous sometimes developed hollow interiors, and the damp, protected space inside a fallen trunk would have been an ideal refuge for a vulnerable soft-shelled Arthropleura waiting out its molting period. Like Meganeura, Arthropleura's eventual extinction was tied to the environmental changes that ended the Carboniferous. As the great coal swamps dried and the equatorial forest retreated, the habitat that Arthropleura depended on shrank. The dense, wet, low-lying forests with their abundant plant debris and their warm, humid air were the world this animal was built for. When that world contracted, Arthropleura contracted with it and eventually disappeared entirely. Its disappearance was part of a broader pattern, the slow unwinding of the Carboniferous ecosystem as the planet's climate shifted toward the conditions of the Permian. But before we follow that story to its conclusion, it is worth spending some time in the water because the seas of the ancient Earth were at least as remarkable as its forests, and in some ways considerably more so. Most of the great biological diversity of the pre-dinosaur world did not live on land. It lived in the ocean. The land had only been colonized by animals relatively recently in geological terms. The first tetrapods made their way onto the beach perhaps 375 million years ago, and the process of establishing complex terrestrial ecosystems took tens of millions of years after that. The sea, by contrast, had been home to complex animal life for hundreds of millions of years longer. The Panthalassa Ocean of the Carboniferous period was not a simple body of water. Its surface was divided by latitudinal temperature gradients, its depth stratified by layers of different density and chemical composition, its floors marked by mountain ranges and trenches of extraordinary scale. The coastal shelves of Pangaea, where sunlight could still reach the bottom, were among the most productive marine environments the planet has ever seen. Rich in nutrients, warmed by equatorial sun, teeming with life at every scale from the microscopic to the genuinely monstrous. The creatures that inhabited these ancient seas included some of the most fascinating arthropods in the entire fossil record. Among the most significant of these, significant both in their evolutionary history and in their sheer physical impact, were the Eurypterids. Eurypterids are sometimes called sea scorpions, and while that name captures something of their appearance, it is somewhat misleading about their actual relationship to modern scorpions. Eurypterids were not the direct ancestors of scorpions. They represent their own branch of the arthropod evolutionary tree, a branch that was enormously successful for hundreds of millions of years before ultimately going extinct at the end of the Permian period. They first appeared in the fossil record roughly 500 million years ago and persisted, evolving and diversifying until the great end Permian extinction event. The Eurypterids were built on a distinctive body plan. The front of the body, the prosoma or head region, carried the eyes and the feeding appendages. Behind it was the mesosoma, a broader middle section that bore the swimming paddles and walking legs. And behind that was the metasoma, a narrower, more flexible tail section that ended in a pointed appendage called the telson. This basic organisation was consistent across the group. though the details varied enormously between species. At the upper end of Eurypterid size was Echolopterus, known from fossils found in what is now Germany and dating to roughly 390 million years ago, somewhat earlier than the Carboniferous during the Devonian period. Estimates of Echolopterus's body length based on the proportions of its fossilized chelicerae, the large grasping front claws, suggest an animal that may have reached nearly 2.5 to nearly 3 meters in total body length. This would make Echolopterus the largest known arthropod that has ever lived. The claw fragments that anchor this estimate are striking in themselves. They are massive structures, heavily mineralized, equipped with pointed projections for gripping prey. An animal with claws of that scale would have been a formidable predator, capable of handling quite substantial prey. The hydromechanics of Echolopterus's swimming paddles suggest reasonable agility in the water. The wide, flat appendages on the mesosoma could generate thrust efficiently, allowing the animal to accelerate quickly over short distances and execute turns with meaningful precision. Whether Echolopterus was the fastest swimmer in its environment is unlikely. Size and speed are often in tension in aquatic animals, and the animal's large body would have created drag. But it did not need to be the fastest swimmer. It needed only to be fast enough to catch what it hunted, and in the Devonian and Carboniferous seas there was an abundance of prey that was significantly slower than Echolopterus. A different Eurypterid, Hibbertopterus, offers a striking contrast in lifestyle. Where Echolopterus was built for active, three-dimensional predation in the water column, Hibbertopterus appears to have been a bottom-dwelling animal. Its body was wide and heavily armoured, built closer to the ground, and its forelimbs had a structure more consistent with sifting through substrate than with seizing actively swimming prey. The trackways left by Hibbertopterus on ancient mudflats, some of the most evocative trace fossils in the entire Carboniferous record, show the characteristic dragging, shuffling motion of an animal that moved slowly and clumsily when it ventured onto land. That these animals came onto land at all is itself significant. The evidence suggests that Eurypterids were capable of surviving in air for meaningful periods of time, whether they had a fully dual respiratory system, gills for water and some form of air-breathing organ for land, or whether they simply had gills that remained functional as long as they stayed moist, is a question the fossil record has not yet answered definitively. What is clear is that Eurypterids were not purely aquatic. They were capable of crossing the boundary between water and land, and they appear to have done so regularly. Why would an animal that was apparently well adapted to aquatic life bother coming onto land? Several explanations have been proposed. Migration between water bodies during periods of drought is one possibility. An animal that could briefly cross dry ground to reach a new lake or river would have a significant survival advantage in a seasonally dry environment. Breeding on land, as some modern marine animals do, is another possibility. Molting on land, in the manner possibly used by Arthropleura, is a third. The Eurypterids as a group were already declining by the time the Carboniferous was in full swing. Their great period of diversity was the Silurian and Devonian, earlier periods when they had occupied a wider range of ecological roles. By the Carboniferous, they were still present and still producing large, impressive species, but the group as a whole was contracting. Competition from increasingly sophisticated fish, vertebrates with proper jaws, fast swimming speeds, and increasingly complex brains had pushed Eurypterids out of many of the niches they had previously dominated. They would persist until the very end of the Paleozoic era, and then disappear entirely in the great extinction event that marks the boundary between the Permian and the Triassic. But in the Carboniferous seas they were still a significant presence, large, distinctive, occupying the middle and upper levels of the marine food web, sharing the water with animals that were in some ways even more ancient and even more remarkable. If the Eurypterids were the apex predators of the ancient coastal shelves, then the Trilobites were something altogether different. They were the background, the constant, the creatures that had been there so long and in such abundance that the seafloor of the Paleozoic would have been nearly unimaginable without them. Trilobites are among the most successful animals in the entire history of multicellular life. They first appear in the fossil record roughly 520 million years ago, during the Cambrian period, and they persisted, evolving, diversifying, producing new forms, adapting to new environments, for nearly 270 million years. To place that in some kind of human context, the entire span of time from the first dinosaurs to the present day is roughly 230 million years. Trilobites outlasted that window by tens of millions of years. They came in extraordinary variety. Scientists have formally described more than 20,000 trilobite species, and the actual number that existed, including the vast majority that were never fossilized or have not yet been discovered, was certainly many times larger. Some trilobites were barely a millimeter long. Others, like the species Isotolus rex discovered in Minnesota in 1999, reached lengths of 72 centimeters and widths approaching 40 centimeters. Fragmentary evidence suggests that some species may have grown even larger, close to a meter in total body length, which would make them among the largest arthropods of their time. The basic body plan of a trilobite was consistent across the group, even across the enormous span of geological time during which they existed. The body was divided lengthwise into 3 lobes, hence the name, and crosswise into 3 main sections: the cephalon or head, the thorax, and the pygidium or tail. The head carried the sensory organs, including the eyes and the feeding appendages. The thorax consisted of a series of articulated segments, each bearing a pair of appendages that could function variously as legs for walking, gills for breathing, and in some species as paddle-like structures for swimming. The pygidium was a fused tail plate shorter than the thorax that often ended in a terminal spine. This body plan was enormously versatile. Some trilobites were benthic animals that spent their lives ploughing slowly through sediment on the sea floor, filtering organic material from the substrate. Others were active swimmers, spending their time in the open water column, hunting plankton or small soft-bodied prey. Others still were predators, slow, patient, pursuing prey across the seafloor despite the apparent absence of the kind of powerful crushing jaws that might seem necessary for active predation. One of the most distinctive features of trilobites, and one that has fascinated scientists since the first serious studies of these fossils in the 18th century, is their visual system. Trilobites had compound eyes, as all arthropods do, but their eyes were unique in the animal kingdom in a very specific and remarkable way. While the lenses of virtually every other animal's eyes are made of protein-based materials, organic compounds that are flexible, refractive, and biologically produced, trilobite lenses were made of calcite, calcium carbonate, the same mineral that forms limestone and marble. Calcite is an unusual choice for a lens material. It is hard, brittle, and crystalline. It has a relatively high refractive index, which means it bends light quite strongly. It is also naturally transparent in certain crystallographic orientations, which is essential for a functional lens. The trilobites that evolved calcite lenses effectively solved the optical engineering problem that calcite's high refractive index creates: the tendency to produce chromatic aberration, the splitting of light into its component colours, by developing lens structures whose geometry compensated for this effect. Some trilobite lens designs closely parallel optical solutions that human engineers independently derived centuries later. This is one of those facts in paleontology that takes a moment to fully absorb. Animals that lived 400 million years ago had eyes whose optical engineering was sophisticated enough that the same mathematical principles governing their function were only rediscovered by humans working on lens design in the 17th and 18th centuries. The trilobites' talent for visual sophistication was matched by their behavioural flexibility. Evidence from fossils suggests that trilobites could roll into a ball when threatened, tucking the soft ventral surface of the body inside the protective shell, presenting a hardened exterior to a potential predator. This defensive behaviour, analogous to what modern woodlice do today, was clearly widespread across many trilobite lineages. Some specimens have been found preserved in the enrolled position, suggesting that death caught them mid-defense. Trilobites also show evidence of complex social behaviors in some species. Mass assemblages of trilobite fossils, sometimes dozens of individuals arranged in rows or clusters, have been interpreted as evidence of breeding aggregations analogous to the mass breeding events seen in modern horseshoe crabs. The idea that animals living 500 million years ago were gathering in coordinated groups for reproduction is a reminder that behavioural sophistication is not an invention of the vertebrates. The decline of trilobites is a long, slow story with a sudden ending. Through the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and Carboniferous periods, trilobites gradually diversified less and occupied fewer ecological roles. Each of the major extinction events of the Paleozoic, and there were several, reduced their numbers and diversity, and the subsequent recoveries never quite restored the variety that had been lost. By the Permian period, trilobites were still present but clearly diminished, a shadow of their earlier abundance. Then, approximately 252 million years ago, everything changed at once. Before we move forward in time toward the catastrophe that ended the Paleozoic, it is worth looking even further back, to a period so ancient that the Carboniferous itself would have seemed almost modern by comparison. The Cambrian period, which began roughly 540 million years ago, was one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of life on Earth. In a span of geological time that seems brief by the standards of deep history, perhaps 20 to 30 million years, the major body plans of most animal phyla that exist today appear in the fossil record. Not the specific animals themselves, not the familiar forms that followed, but the basic architectural blueprints that evolution has been working with ever since. This event, known as the Cambrian explosion, though the word explosion somewhat overstates the speed of a process that still took millions of years, produced an extraordinary diversity of body forms. Some of these were experiments that evolution quickly abandoned, others were the ancestors of everything that followed, and some were animals so strange, so unlike anything that came before or after, that their discovery in the 20th century genuinely challenged the way scientists thought about the history of life. Among the most remarkable of these Cambrian animals was Anomalocaris. Its name means abnormal shrimp, and the name has a charming scientific history behind it. When the first fragments of this animal were discovered, they were described as separate animals. A curved appendage was identified as an incomplete crustacean. A circular mouth structure was initially classified as a kind of jellyfish. It was only when more complete specimens came to light that researchers realized these fragments were all parts of the same creature. The appendage was the grasping limb of the front of the body. The circular structure was the mouth. The complete animal was unlike any of its misidentified parts had suggested. Anomalocaris was a free-swimming predator, elongated and flexible, propelled through the water by a series of swimming flaps along the sides of its body. At the front were two large articulated appendages that could grasp prey with considerable force. The mouth was a circular structure ringed with hard plates, arranged in a pattern of overlapping elements that could compress inward to grip food. And the eyes were remarkable. Anomalocaris had compound eyes on stalks, positioned to give it excellent three-dimensional visual coverage. When researchers analysed the structure of fossilised Anomalocaris eyes in detail, preserved specimens were found in Australia's Emu Bay Shale. The number of individual lenses in each eye was staggering. Estimates suggest somewhere around 16,000 individual lens units in a single eye. A modern housefly, for comparison, has roughly 4,000. The visual acuity of Anomalocaris would have been exceptional by the standards of its time, and arguably by the standards of any time. The largest Anomalocaris specimens so far discovered are approximately 1 metre in body length, though some researchers have suggested that larger individuals may have existed. Even at 1 metre, Anomalocaris was substantially the largest animal in its Cambrian ecosystem, a predator that dwarfed nearly everything else in the water, equipped with sophisticated senses, effective locomotion, and impressive grasping appendages. How Anomalocaris actually hunted has been the subject of considerable debate. The early interpretation, a fierce active predator that seized and crushed hard-shelled prey, was subsequently challenged by biomechanical analysis suggesting that the mouth plates were not capable of generating the forces necessary to break the shells of large trilobites. Some researchers proposed that Anomalocaris was instead a filter feeder, sweeping the water for soft-bodied plankton and small organisms. Others argued for a middle position, an active predator of soft-bodied prey, using its grasping appendages to manipulate food items toward its circular mouth. More recent work has tended to support a view of Anomalocaris as genuinely predatory, but with a diet that was probably more varied than any single interpretation suggests. Animals of this size, with this level of mobility and sensory sophistication, are rarely specialists. The fossil record provides hints. Some trilobite fossils have been found with damage patterns consistent with a Anomalocaris attack, but also with evidence that the trilobites survived the encounter. An attack that fails to immediately kill a trilobite is more consistent with a predator trying to work through a shell by manipulation than one delivering a single crushing bite. Anomalocaris belongs to a broader group known as the Anomalocaridids, or, more formally, as early members of a group called Radiodonta. This group represents one of those important early branches of arthropod evolution, not the ancestor of any modern arthropod family, but a parallel experiment in arthropod body design that was enormously successful for its time. Anomalocaris itself did not survive into the Carboniferous. It was a Cambrian animal, and by the time the Devonian period arrived it had been gone for tens of millions of years. But the story of Anomalocaris is relevant to the broader narrative of life before dinosaurs, because it illustrates a principle that runs through all of this history. The world was full of complex, sophisticated, ecologically significant animals long before the vertebrates arrived to dominate it. The vertebrate-dominated world, the world of fish, amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, and mammals, is actually the recent world. The older world, the deeper past, belonged to forms of life built on entirely different plans. To understand the animals of the pre-dinosaur world fully, you have to understand the plants. Not as passive backdrop, as active shapers of the environment. The vegetation of the Carboniferous was not just scenery. It was the engine driving the atmosphere, the architect of the landscape, the foundation of every food web, and ultimately the source of the coal that defines the period. We have already touched on the lycopsid trees, the great club mosses that dominated the equatorial forests, but it is worth spending a moment with the full picture of Carboniferous vegetation, because it was genuinely unlike anything that has existed since. The tallest trees in a Carboniferous forest were the lepidodendron, so-called scale trees, whose name refers to the distinctive diamond-shaped leaf scar patterns on their bark. A full-grown lepidodendron might stand 30 to 40 metres tall, with a trunk diameter of a metre or more at the base. The bark was thick and structural, in some species accounting for a large proportion of the total tree mass, while the actual wood underneath was relatively thin and soft. This is an inverted relationship compared to most modern trees, where the wood is the primary structural element. Lepidodendron grew quickly and died relatively young by tree standards. The branching occurred primarily at the very top of the trunk, producing a crown of forking branches that spread outward and downward, covered in long grass-like leaves. When those leaves fell, as they did continuously throughout the tree's life, they left the distinctive scars that give the species its characteristic bark texture. From a distance, a lepidodendron forest would have had an almost surreal visual quality. Tall, straight, unbranched trunks for most of their height, then suddenly exploding into complex canopies at the top. The bark below marked with patterns unlike anything in the modern plant world. Growing alongside the lepidodendron were the Sigillaria, a related Lycopside genus, somewhat shorter and somewhat more tolerant of waterlogged soils. Sigillaria trunks were marked with their own distinctive scar pattern, hexagonal rather than diamond-shaped, and their wood was even softer and less structural than lepidodendron. In some reconstructions of Carboniferous swamp forests, Sigillaria form a lower canopy beneath the taller lepidodendron, creating a layered forest structure with multiple distinct light environments at different heights. The Carboniferous also hosted giant horsetails, relatives of the modern equisetum plants that still grow today in moist environments, but vastly larger. Modern horsetails rarely exceed a metre in height. Their Carboniferous ancestors, genus Calamites, grew to 15 metres or more, with woody stems and a jointed structure that made them unmistakably distinctive even in fossil form. They favoured wet, low-lying areas, often forming dense stands along riverbanks and in swamp margins. Between these larger plants, the forest floor and understory were filled with ferns, not the modest ferns of a modern woodland garden, but tree ferns, some reaching heights of several metres, their fronds spreading in the filtered light beneath the canopy above. These ferns were the primary ground cover of the Carboniferous equatorial zone, and their abundance in the fossil record gives us a rich picture of their diversity. What was absent from all of this, as noted earlier, is worth reflecting on again. There were no flowers, no fruit, no grasses, no broadleaf deciduous trees dropping autumn colour. The Carboniferous forest was entirely green, a constant, unvarying green, without the seasonal visual drama that defines so many modern landscapes. The reproductive strategies of all these plants were tied to spores rather than seeds, which meant that reproduction depended on water. Sperm cells had to swim through surface moisture to reach the eggs. This constrained where these plants could successfully reproduce, concentrating the forests in wet areas and making them vulnerable to any sustained shift toward drier conditions. The insects and other invertebrates that lived in and among these forests had no flowers to pollinate, no fruit to eat. The food relationships were different, dominated by leaf-eating and detritus feeding rather than the fruit-eating and nectar feeding that characterize so many modern invertebrate-plant relationships. Some researchers have proposed that certain Carboniferous insects may have fed on spore-bearing structures, a kind of proto-pollination relationship, but the evidence for this is limited. The forest as a whole was a system under constant tension. The trees grew at an extraordinary rate, pumping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in their massive bodies. The fallen trees accumulated without decomposing. The oxygen level rose, the carbon dioxide level fell. These changes were not smooth or linear, they fluctuated, sometimes dramatically, creating conditions that periodically stressed even the organisms best adapted to this world. Toward the end of the Carboniferous, the great swamp forests began to retreat. The causes were multiple and interrelated. Global temperatures shifted. The interior of Pangaea became drier. The extensive swamps contracted. In their place came scrublands and open woodlands, more tolerant of drier conditions, but far less productive in terms of biomass per unit area. This contraction had consequences that cascaded through the ecosystem. The giant insects that depended on high oxygen levels found those levels declining. The giant arthropods that depended on the dense, moist forest habitat found that habitat shrinking. The amphibians that had colonized the swamp margin found themselves competing with a new group of vertebrates, the reptiles, whose amniotic eggs allowed them to reproduce away from water, giving them access to the drier inland environments that amphibians could not reach. The world was changing, and the change, once underway, did not stop. The Carboniferous was not only the age of giant insects, it was also the period during which the vertebrate lineage first established itself on land with any real permanence, and began the long journey toward the animals that would eventually dominate the Permian, the Mesozoic, and ultimately the modern world. The first tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates, had appeared during the late Devonian period, perhaps 375 to 360 million years ago. Their origins lie in a group of lobe-finned fish whose pectoral and pelvic fins were already more limb-like than those of most fish, muscular, robust, capable of supporting weight and generating pushing force against a substrate. Animals like Tiktaalik, discovered in the early 21st century in Arctic Canada and dated to approximately 375 million years ago, preserve a remarkable anatomical intermediate, a fish with a flat, broad head, a flexible neck, and fins whose internal skeletal structure closely anticipates the arm and hand bones of tetrapods. The transition from water to land was not a single dramatic event. It was a long, gradual process, or rather multiple overlapping processes, as different lineages of lobe-finned fish independently experimented with spending more time in shallow water and on exposed substrate. The physical challenges of life on land are considerable. An animal that evolved in water suddenly has to support its own body weight without buoyancy, has to breathe air rather than dissolving oxygen from water, has to resist desiccation in a dry environment, and has to move effectively on a substrate with friction rather than through a fluid medium. The early tetrapods solved some of these problems more elegantly than others. They had functional lungs, a feature inherited from their lobe-finned fish ancestors, which had already evolved lungs as a supplement to gill-based respiration in environments where water oxygen levels were low. They had limbs capable of supporting their body weight, at least briefly, but they remained closely tied to water. Their eggs, like fish eggs, were water-dependent. Their skin required moisture to function effectively as a gas exchange surface. They were, in an important sense, fish that could walk, not land animals that happened to retain some fish-like features. The early Carboniferous amphibians that descended from these first tetrapods were diverse and numerous by the standards of vertebrate land life at the time. They included forms that were large and predatory. Crassigyrinus, for instance, an elongated, somewhat eel-like animal that may have reached 2 meters in length, with reduced limbs suggesting it had actually secondarily readapted to an aquatic lifestyle after its ancestors had been more terrestrially capable, and they included forms that were smaller, more lizard-like in general appearance, experimenting with the possibilities of life away from the water's edge. But the real revolution in vertebrate land life came with the evolution of the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg, the kind familiar from reptiles and birds today, is a self-contained system. It carries its own water supply, stored in a membrane called the amnion, surrounding the embryo. It carries its own nutrients. It is sealed against moisture loss by a shell, which in early amniotes was leathery rather than hard. An animal with an amniotic egg can lay that egg on dry land. It no longer needs to return to water to reproduce. The first amniotes, the ancestor of all reptiles, birds and mammals, appeared during the early Carboniferous, perhaps 310 to 315 million years ago. The oldest known amniot fossils come from the Joggins Fossil Cliffs in Nova Scotia, a remarkable site where the upright trunks of Carboniferous leucopsid trees are preserved in place, sometimes with the remains of small vertebrates preserved inside the hollow trunks, animals that apparently fell in and could not climb back out. These early amniotes were small, lizard-like animals. Holonomus is perhaps the best known, and they would not have impressed a Carboniferous observer. They were tiny relative to the giant arthropods around them, occupying the ecological role of small insectivores in the forest understory. But the innovation they carried, the waterproofed egg, the skin less dependent on external moisture, the slightly improved ability to conserve water in a dry environment, was transformative in its long-term implications. Over the course of the late Carboniferous and into the Permian, the amniotes diversified rapidly. They split into 2 major lineages. One, the sauropsids, would eventually give rise to all reptiles and birds, including the dinosaurs. The other, the synapsids, would eventually give rise to mammals, and by way of mammals to us. The Permian period that followed the Carboniferous was not the age of dinosaurs. It was the age of synapsids, mammal-like reptiles as they are sometimes called, though that description is somewhat misleading, that dominated terrestrial ecosystems before the end Permian extinction reshuffled the cards entirely. But in the Carboniferous, all of this was still in the future. The amniotes were small and peripheral. The world belonged to the giant arthropods, the amphibians, and the sea. The Carboniferous gave way to the Permian roughly 299 million years ago, and the transition, while not marked by any single catastrophic event, represented a genuine environmental transformation. The great swamp forests that had defined the Carboniferous, that had built the oxygen spike, that had created the coal deposits, that had supported the giant insects, contracted and largely disappeared. The climate became cooler and drier. The interior of Pangaea, already challenging, became increasingly arid. These changes were not uniform. The Permian was a long period, as nearly 50 million years, and conditions varied considerably from its beginning to its end. But the overall trajectory was toward a world that was, in many respects, more similar to the modern world than the Carboniferous had been. Oxygen levels declined toward modern values. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated. Global temperatures went through cycles of warming and cooling. And life adapted as it always does, though the adaptation sometimes required millions of years of evolution to complete. The Permian is best understood through its vertebrate life, which was genuinely extraordinary. The synapsids, the lineage that would eventually produce mammals, had diversified enormously by the Middle Permian, producing animals that range from small herbivores to large, impressive predators. Among the most iconic of the early Permian vertebrates were the pelycosaurs, a group that included Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon is frequently and incorrectly described as a dinosaur. It was not. It was not even particularly closely related to dinosaurs. Dimetrodon was a synapsid, closer to the mammalian lineage than to the reptilian one, and it lived and died tens of millions of years before the first dinosaur ever appeared. Its distinctive sail, formed by elongated neural spines on the vertebrae and covered in skin, has fascinated paleontologists and the general public alike for decades. The function of the sail is still debated. The most intuitively appealing explanation, that it served as a thermoregulatory device, collecting solar heat in the morning to warm the animal for activity and shedding heat in the afternoon to prevent overheating, has been modelled mathematically and found to be at least partially plausible. A large sail of thin, well-vascularized skin would indeed function as an effective heat exchanger. But there are complications. The sail's effectiveness depends on orientation relative to the sun, and it is not clear that Dimetrodon would have oriented itself in the optimal way. Other functions, display, species recognition, intraspecific communication, have also been proposed. What is clear is that Dimetrodon was the dominant predator of its environment. It grew to lengths of 3 to 4 meters in the largest known species, and its skull bore differentiated teeth. Not the simple, uniform teeth of many reptiles, but teeth of different shapes and sizes suited to different functions. The canine-like teeth at the front of the jaw were well suited for stabbing and gripping prey. This tooth differentiation, called heterodonty, is a characteristic that Dimetrodon shares with mammals and that distinguishes the synapsid lineage from most other reptile-like animals of the time. Alongside Dimetrodon in the early Permian lived an array of other synapsids filling herbivore and omnivore roles. The low-slung, heavily built Edaphosaurus, which also bore a sail but was probably a plant-eater. The large, barrel-bodied Cotylorhynchus, whose enormous gut housed the fermentation chambers needed to process tough plant material, and various smaller forms that occupied the ecological space that rodents and insectivores fill in modern ecosystems. By the Middle Permian, the pelycosaurs had been largely replaced by a more derived group of synapsids called the therapsids. The therapsids were, in many respects, more mammal-like than their pelycosaur predecessors. Their legs were positioned more directly under the body rather than sprawling outward to the sides, giving them a more upright stance and a more efficient gait. Their skulls showed increasingly elaborate differentiation of the jaw and temporal region. Some of them may have had a degree of physiological temperature regulation, some early form of the warm-bloodedness that characterizes modern mammals. Among the therapsids, the dicynodonts were particularly remarkable. These were mostly herbivores, some of enormous size. The late Permian dicynodont Lystrosaurus was the most abundant large-land animal on Earth immediately after the end Permian extinction, and a related form, Moschops, was a large, heavily built browser that may have used its thick skull in headbutting contests over resources or mates. The Gorgonopsids, meanwhile, were the apex predators of the middle and late Permian, sleek, long-legged synapsids with enlarged canine teeth that resembled, in their general functional anatomy, the saber-toothed cats of the much later Cenozoic. The Permian world was a world in which vertebrates had finally established the kind of dominance on land that they maintain today. The giant arthropods were gone. The great equatorial swamp forests had contracted. In their place, a more familiar ecological structure had emerged: large herbivores, large predators, smaller omnivores, and insectivores filling the gaps between them. And then, 252 million years ago, almost everything died. The end Permian extinction event is known among paleontologists as the Great Dying, and the name does not overstate the case. It is the most severe extinction event in the fossil record, the single largest loss of biodiversity in the history of complex animal life on Earth. The numbers, stated plainly, are almost difficult to process. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species went extinct. On land, something like 70 to 80% of vertebrate species disappeared. The world's ecosystems, ocean and terrestrial alike, collapsed, and in some regions showed essentially no recovery for several million years afterward. What caused it? This is a question that paleontologists, geochemists, and climate scientists have been working on for decades, and while a clear picture has emerged, the details are still being refined. The primary cause is now widely accepted to be a massive episode of volcanic activity centered in what is now Siberia. The Siberian Traps, a vast igneous province covering an area larger than modern Europe, erupted over a period of perhaps 1 to 2 million years, releasing staggering quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere. The scale of this eruption was far beyond anything in human historical experience. It was not a single eruption, or even a series of discrete eruptions in the familiar sense. It was a prolonged geological event, a slow outpouring of lava and gas from fissures in the crust, punctuated by more intense episodes, releasing a total volume of volcanic material estimated at 2 to 3 million cubic kilometers. The carbon dioxide released by this volcanic activity drove rapid and severe global warming. Ocean temperatures rose. The chemistry of the ocean water shifted. Absorbed carbon dioxide forms carbonic acid, and as carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere rose, the ocean acidified measurably. Acidification disrupts the formation of calcium carbonate shells and skeletons, which are central to the survival of enormous numbers of marine organisms including corals, mollusks, and many plankton species. The warming also drove stratification of the ocean, warm surface water sitting atop cooler, denser deep water, preventing the circulation that normally brings oxygenated surface water down to depth. Large portions of the deep ocean became anoxic, severely depleted in oxygen, and the organisms that lived there died. On land, the warming was accompanied by increased aridity in many regions, disruption of precipitation patterns, and acid rain driven by the sulfur dioxide emissions from the traps. The vegetation that had established itself across Pangaea during the Permian died back dramatically. Without plant cover, soils eroded. Without soil, plant recovery was slower. The cascading effects moved through the food web in both directions. Herbivores lost their food, and the predators that depended on herbivores lost theirs. The marine recovery after the end Permian extinction was genuinely slow by geological standards. the most diverse reef-building ecosystems, built primarily on corals and associated organisms, were essentially absent from the fossil record for roughly 5 to 10 million years after the extinction. Paleontologists call this interval the reef gap, and its existence tells us something about the severity of the disruption. Reef ecosystems are among the most complex and interdependent in the ocean. They require not just the survival of reef-building organisms, but the recovery of the full ecological community that those organisms depend on and support. When the disruption is severe enough to collapse the entire community, recovery is not just a matter of surviving organisms reproducing. It requires the reconstruction of an ecological network, and that takes time even when the underlying environmental conditions have returned to something tolerable. On land, the recovery was somewhat faster in some regions and slower in others. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, the world was populated by a relatively small number of generalist survivor species, organisms that were flexible enough in their diet and habitat requirements to persist through the chaos. The Dicynodont Lystrosaurus is the most famous example. This stout, relatively small herbivore was found across an enormous geographic range in the earliest Triassic, suggesting that it was both a survivor and a rapid colonizer of newly vacated ecological space. From these survivors, over the tens of millions of years of the Triassic period that followed, the diversity of terrestrial vertebrate life was rebuilt. But it was rebuilt differently from what had existed before. The synapsids, the mammal-like lineage that had dominated the Permian, never fully regained the ecological prominence they had held before the extinction. In their place, a group that had been peripheral during the Permian now rose to prominence, the archosaurs. The archosaurs were a group of reptiles, sauropsids, part of the lineage that diverges from the synapsid mammalian line, that had existed during the Permian but had never been dominant. After the end Permian extinction, however, the archosaurs diversified explosively during the Triassic period, filling ecological roles that the devastated synapsid fauna could no longer occupy. The archosaur lineage splits into two major branches: the pseudosuchians, which give rise to modern crocodilians, and the avemetatarsalia, which give rise to pterosaurs and dinosaurs. During the early and middle Triassic, the pseudosuchians were actually the more successful branch in many terrestrial environments. Animals like Postosuchus, a large terrestrially capable predator with deep blade-like teeth, were the apex predators of many Triassic communities, ecologically analogous to what Dimetrodon had been in the Permian. The early dinosaurs, when they appeared in the fossil record roughly 230 to 240 million years ago, were not yet the dominant animals on Earth. They were small to medium-sized bipedally capable animals, faster and more agile than many of their competitors, but not yet large. The oldest confidently identified dinosaur fossils come from South America, notably from Argentina, where forms like Euraptor and Herrerasaurus have been found in the Esquigolasto Formation, in rocks dated to approximately 230 million years ago. These early dinosaurs were not the giants of popular imagination. Euraptor was roughly a metre long and probably omnivorous. Herrerasaurus was larger and more clearly predatory, but still a modest animal by the standards of what the dinosaurian lineage would eventually produce. They were opportunists, fast, energetically active animals that could exploit the ecological gaps left by the ongoing recovery of the Triassic world. The transition from a world dominated by synapsids and early archosaurs to a world dominated by dinosaurs was not instantaneous. It appears to have been accelerated, perhaps decisively, by another volcanic episode, the Central Atlantic magmatic province eruptions of approximately 201 million years ago, which drove the end-Triassic extinction event. This extinction, while less severe than the end Permian, nonetheless cleared much of the ecological landscape of the competition that had limited dinosaur diversification. In the aftermath, the dinosaurs expanded rapidly into roles and environments they had not previously occupied. By the early Jurassic period, roughly 190 million years ago, the world was recognisably the dinosaur world. Sauropods, the long-necked, enormous-bodied plant-eaters that represent the popular image of dinosaurs perhaps more than any other group, were already present and growing toward the body sizes that would eventually make them the largest land animals in the history of the planet. Theropods, the bipedal predators whose lineage would ultimately give rise to birds, were diversifying rapidly. Ornithischians, the third great dinosaur group, encompassing horned, armoured and duck-billed forms, were establishing the lineages that would produce some of the most recognisable dinosaur species of the Cretaceous. But we should pause here, before we follow the dinosaurs into their own remarkable story, to look back at the full sweep of what had come before. There is a particular kind of perspective that geology offers, and it is one that takes time to fully settle into the mind. When we think about the past, we tend to think about it in human terms, in centuries and generations in the span of a single lifetime multiplied outward a few times. Even when we stretch our thinking toward history in the broader sense, we're usually thinking about thousands of years. The rise and fall of civilizations, the spread of agriculture, the long walk of our species out of Africa. But the story we have been following together exists on a different scale entirely. The Carboniferous Period, the time of giant millipedes and enormous dragonflies, of vast swamp forests and oxygen-rich air, ended nearly 300 million years ago. The end Permian extinction that erased so much of what the Paleozoic had built happened 252 million years ago. The first dinosaurs appeared roughly 230 million years ago. These numbers, written out, look similar to one another, but the gaps between them, the 50 million years of the Permian, the 30 million years of the Triassic, were each longer than the entire subsequent age of dinosaurs, and the age of dinosaurs itself was nearly 200 million years long. We are, in a very real sense, the most recent thing, the newest entry in a record that stretches back past comprehension. The world has been doing this, building, elaborating, collapsing, rebuilding, for so long that any single chapter of it, even a chapter as long and dramatic as the age of dinosaurs, occupies only a small fraction of the total story. And before the dinosaurs, before the Great Dying, before the Permian synapsids and their mammal-like faces and differentiated teeth, before even the Carboniferous forests, there was more. There was always more. From here, the story becomes less about solving a puzzle and more about slowly observing what these discoveries suggest when we allow ourselves to simply sit with them. The facts do not change, but the feeling of them does, when you stop rushing toward conclusions and simply let the weight of deep time rest quietly around you. The ocean was old before the land had anything worth calling life. The arthropods had built their complex bodies, their compound eyes and segmented shells and jointed limbs, hundreds of millions of years before the first vertebrate hauled itself onto a muddy bank. The world we call prehistoric was itself preceded by a world even more prehistoric, and that world by another, all the way down to the beginning of complex life itself, 540 million years ago, and beyond that to the first single-celled life, 3.5 billion years ago, and beyond that to the planet itself, forming from a disk of gas and dust 4.5 billion years before this moment. You are right now sitting in the most recent possible instant of all of that. It is, when held gently in the mind, a remarkably calming thought. Let us go back further still, not rushing toward any particular destination, but moving slowly through the deep water of geological time, pausing here and there to observe what the evidence shows us. Before the Cambrian explosion, before the Trilobites, before Ediacaran and its extraordinary eyes, the oceans of the Earth were already alive. They had been alive for an enormous stretch of time. The Precambrian, a span of geological history so long that it constitutes nearly 90% of the entire age of the Earth. And yet the Precambrian left a fossil record that is sparse, difficult to interpret, and in many ways still actively mysterious to the scientists who study it. The reason for this sparseness is straightforward. Most of the organisms that lived in the Precambrian ocean were soft-bodied. They had no shells, no bones, no mineralized structures of any kind. Soft tissue decays quickly after death, and only under very particular conditions. Rapid burial in fine-grained sediment, in the absence of oxygen scavenging organisms, is it preserved at all. Most Precambrian life left no direct record of its existence, only geochemical signatures in the rock, patterns of isotope ratios, organic molecular residues, the altered chemistry of ancient sediments that allow geochemists to infer the presence and rough nature of the organisms that produced them. But there are exceptions, and those exceptions are among the most remarkable fossil sites anywhere on Earth. The Ediacaran period, which immediately preceded the Cambrian and lasted from roughly 635 to 540 million years ago, takes its name from the Ediacara Hills of South Australia, where distinctive fossils of soft-bodied organisms were first formally described in the mid-20th century. Ediacaran fossils are now known from sites on every continent, and they preserve a collection of organisms so unusual in their body forms that scientists have debated for decades how to classify them and what they actually were. Dickinsonia is perhaps the most famous Ediacaran organism. It was a flat, oval, bilaterally symmetrical creature with a regular pattern of segments across its surface. It could grow to nearly a metre in length. It left distinctive impressions in the seafloor sediment, including what appear to be feeding traces, evidence that it moved across the microbial mats that carpeted the Ediacaran seafloor, absorbing nutrients through its lower surface as it travelled. The question of what Dickinsonia actually was has been fiercely debated. Early interpretations placed it variously as an annelid worm, a jellyfish, a placozoan, a lichen, or even something without any modern equivalent, a representative of a now completely extinct kingdom of life, not an animal or a plant or a fungus, but something altogether different. More recent analysis, including the detection of cholesterol compounds in exceptionally preserved Dickinsonia fossils, has swung opinion toward an animal interpretation. Cholesterol is an animal biosynthetic product. Finding it associated with Dickinsonia fossils is strong, though not conclusive, evidence that Dickinsonia was an animal. Other Ediacaran organisms were even stranger. Tribrachidium had a three-way radial symmetry, not the bilateral symmetry that characterises almost all complex animals, and not the simple radial symmetry of jellyfish and sea anemones, but a threefold symmetry with no modern equivalent. Charnia was a frond-like organism anchored to the seafloor by a holdfast, its body branching in a pattern called fractal, or self-similar, the same branching pattern repeating at progressively smaller scales. Whether Charnia was an animal, a colonial organism of some kind, or something outside those categories is still genuinely uncertain. The Ediacaran biota as a whole represents a world in which the rules of body construction had not yet been fully settled. Evolution was exploring body plans, testing structural possibilities, elaborating forms that would in many cases turn out to be evolutionary dead ends. Experiments that the Cambrian explosion would replace with a different set of experiments, many of which persist in the modern world. There is something quietly profound about contemplating the Ediacaran. These organisms left their impressions in rock more than 500 million years ago, in seas that covered landscapes now risen into mountain ranges, in an ocean whose chemistry was measurably different from any ocean that has existed since. They were alive, metabolizing, moving, reproducing, interacting with one another and with their environment, and they were doing so with body plans that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Their disappearance at the beginning of the Cambrian was probably not a single extinction event in the way the Permian was. It was more likely a gradual replacement, the new organisms of the Cambrian explosion, equipped with harder body parts that allowed them to burrow, to prey on one another, to disturb the seafloor sediment in ways the soft-bodied Ediacaran organisms could not tolerate, gradually displaced the earlier community. The microbial mats that had carpeted the seafloor, providing the substrate on which Ediacaran life depended, were broken up and disrupted by the new burrowing organisms. The conditions that had allowed the Ediacaran world to persist were altered, and the Ediacaran world went with them. Life continued, it always continued, but it continued differently. Between the Carboniferous and the earlier Cambrian lay the Devonian period, roughly 419 to 359 million years ago, a time that is sometimes called the Age of Fish, and with good reason. The vertebrate lineage, which had existed since the early Cambrian as small filter-feeding animals without jaws, had been steadily elaborating throughout the Silurian and early Devonian. The evolution of the jaw, one of the most consequential anatomical innovations in the history of vertebrates, opened up ecological possibilities that were previously unavailable. A vertebrate with jaws could seize and process food items that a jawless vertebrate could only filter or rasp. It could exploit a much wider range of prey types, including large, hard-shelled invertebrates that had previously been effectively off-limits. The jawed vertebrates, the gnathostoms, diversified explosively during the Devonian, filling the role of active, large-bodied predators in marine and freshwater environments. Among the most remarkable of the early jawed vertebrates were the placoderms, a now entirely extinct group of armoured fish, whose bodies were partly sheathed in bony plates, and whose jaws were constructed on a mechanical principle different from that of any living fish. Dunkleosteus is the most famous placoderm, and its fame is well deserved. The largest species of Dunkleosteus are estimated to have reached 9 to 10 metres in body length. The head and thorax were covered in thick, heavy armour plates that articulated against one another, allowing the skull to tilt upward relative to the lower jaw, creating an enormously wide gape. Rather than teeth in the conventional sense, Dunkleosteus had self-sharpening blades of bone. The edges of the jaw, plates themselves worn to a cutting edge by the action of opening and closing, that could deliver a bite force estimated at levels comparable to large modern sharks. In the Devonian seas, Dunkleosteus was the apex predator. It shared the water with conodonts, early ray-finned fish, early lobe-finned fish, sharks, and the last evolutionary experiments with jawless vertebrate body plans, but nothing that we know of in its environment was large enough or formidable enough to seriously threaten an adult Dunkleosteus. It occupied, in the late Devonian Ocean, the ecological role that great white sharks and orca occupy today. Apex predator, top of the food web, probably a relatively low abundance animal whose presence shaped the behaviour and distribution of everything below it in the food chain. The lobe-finned fish of the Devonian deserves special mention because this group, currently represented by lungfish and the coelacanth, contains the ancestors of all terrestrial vertebrates. The evolutionary transition from lobe-finned fish to tetrapods was one of the defining events in the history of vertebrate life, and the Devonian is when it happened. The fossil record of this transition is now substantially better than it was even 30 years ago, thanks to a series of important discoveries. Eusthenopteron, known from the late Devonian of Canada, was for a long time the classic example of a fish close to the tetrapod ancestor, a lobe-finned fish, whose fin skeleton showed the beginnings of the limb bone arrangement that would later characterise tetrapods. Panderichthys from Latvia showed further modifications in the skull and body plan in a tetrapod-like direction, and Tiktaalik, discovered in 2004 on Ellesmere Island in Arctic Canada, presented an animal so intermediate between fish and tetrapod in its anatomy that it was described in the popular press as a fishapod, an inelegant but not entirely inaccurate description. Tiktaalik had a flat head, a neck capable of independent movement, ribs and pectoral fins with an internal skeleton, organised into elements corresponding to the upper arm, lower arm, and wrist of a tetrapod limb. It could almost certainly prop itself up on its front fins and push itself forward in the manner of a modern mudskipper. Whether it regularly came out of water onto land is not established, but the anatomy suggests it was spending time in very shallow water, possibly in environments where locomotion on the bottom, pushing with the fins against the substrate, was more useful than conventional swimming. The actual first tetrapods, Animals with 4 recognizable limbs rather than fins appear in the fossil record during the late Devonian in forms like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, both known from Greenland. These animals were genuinely 4-limbed, but their limbs were not the efficient walking limbs of later tetrapods. Acanthostega in particular shows a peculiar arrangement. Its limbs appear to have been adapted primarily for use in water, for pushing through aquatic vegetation or manoeuvring in very shallow environments, rather than for effective terrestrial walking. It may have been, in a very real sense, an animal that evolved limbs before it evolved the ability to walk on land. This is one of those findings in paleontology that challenges intuitive assumptions. We tend to think of limbs as an adaptation for walking on land. But the fossil record suggests that limbs evolved first in an aquatic context, and only later became useful for terrestrial locomotion. The first legs were, in a sense, aquatic innovations that turned out to also be useful on land. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that we know any of this at all. Fossils are accidents. They are the products of a particular and unlikely sequence of events. An organism dies, is buried rapidly enough that it is not consumed by scavengers, is buried in an environment where oxygen is low enough that decomposition is slow, is preserved in sediment that eventually turns to rock, is not destroyed by the geological processes, heat, pressure, tectonic movement, that deform and recrystallize rock over millions of years, and is eventually exposed at the surface by erosion, in a place and at a time when a human being happens to be looking for exactly this kind of thing. At every step of this sequence, most organisms fail to make it through. The vast majority of living things that have ever existed on Earth left no fossil record at all. We are working from a sample that is both biased and incomplete, biased toward organisms that lived in environments where burial and preservation were more likely, and biased toward organisms with hard parts that resist decay. The soft-bodied organisms, the animals of the open ocean and the upland forests, the creatures of environments where preservation rarely occurred, their existence must often be inferred rather than directly observed. And yet the record we do have is remarkable in its detail and richness. The Burgess Shale of British Columbia, deposited approximately 508 million years ago, preserves soft-bodied Cambrian organisms in extraordinary detail: gut contents, muscle fibers, sensory organs, behaviours inferred from the positions of preserved bodies. The Messel Pit in Germany, deposited approximately 47 million years ago during the Eocene, preserves mammals with fur, birds with feathers, fish with scales, and even the stomach contents of individual animals, allowing us to know what they had eaten before they died. The La Brea tar pits in California, only around 40,000 years old in their most productive layers, preserve Pleistocene megafauna in such numbers that individual animals can be studied in detail, their bones showing evidence of healed injuries, pathologies, and the marks of predator attacks. Each of these sites is a window, and each window shows a different moment of a story that is, in total, far longer and far richer than any single window can reveal. For the Carboniferous specifically, the coal measures of Europe and North America have provided an unusual wealth of fossil material. The conditions that created the coal, rapid burial in waterlogged low-oxygen environments, were also the conditions most likely to preserve organisms in detail. Insect fossils from the Carboniferous coal measures are sometimes preserved with extraordinary fidelity, showing individual wing veins, the fine structure of compound eyes, even the microscopic hairs on legs and body surfaces. Plant fossils from the same deposits can be so detailed that individual cell structures are visible in thin sections of the rock. These details matter. They are what allow researchers to go beyond the simple identification of what an organism was and begin to reconstruct how it lived, how it moved, what it ate, how it breathed, how it reproduced, how it interacted with its environment and with other organisms. The science of paleontology is, in large measure, the science of wringing the maximum amount of information from very imperfect data. And the practitioners of that science have become remarkably skilled at doing exactly that. In the long history of life on Earth, extinction is not the end of the story. It is a chapter break, sometimes a very long one, sometimes a very painful one, but never the final word. After the Permian extinction wiped out the vast majority of marine species and a large fraction of terrestrial ones, the planet did not remain a bare rock. Life is tenacious in ways that no single catastrophe, however severe, has yet been able to fully extinguish. The survivors, the organisms that happen to have the right combination of physiology, habitat preference, dietary flexibility, and reproductive strategy to make it through, began, slowly, to rebuild. In the ocean, the recovery was measured in millions of years. The earliest Triassic seas were inhabited by a relatively small number of opportunist species. The bivalve Claria, for instance, spread across ocean floors worldwide in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, taking advantage of the absence of competitors. Conodonts, small eel-like vertebrates that had been present and diverse through the Permian, initially survived the extinction and continued into the early Triassic, though they would eventually disappear entirely during the Middle Triassic. Early Triassic fish were mostly small and generalist. The elaborate specialized communities of the Permian reef, the complex interactions between corals and sponges and mollusks and echinoderms, were gone, and would not reassemble in recognizable form for tens of millions of years. On land, the recovery was somewhat faster in parts of the world, though highly uneven. In the southern part of Pangaea, what would later become Antarctica, Australia, India, and parts of Africa and South America, the herbivore Lystrosaurus became extraordinarily abundant in the earliest Triassic. So abundant that paleontologists sometimes describe the ecosystem of this time and place as a Lystrosaurus monoculture. This is an overstatement, but it captures something real. The ecological communities of the early Triassic on land were simpler, less diverse, more dominated by a small number of generalist species than almost anything that had existed during the Permian. Slowly, over the course of the early and middle Triassic, diversity returned. New groups evolved. The archosaurs expanded into ecological roles vacated by the devastated synapsid fauna. The marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs, nothosaurs, and later plesiosaurs, appeared in the oceans, vertebrates secondarily returning to the water and adapting to an aquatic lifestyle with a speed that is remarkable from a geological perspective. The first pterosaurs appeared in the late Triassic, taking to the air and establishing the vertebrate presence in the aerial environment that would persist, through pterosaurs first and then through birds, to the present day. And somewhere in the margins of these recovering ecosystems, the early mammals were also present. Tiny, mostly nocturnal, probably warm-blooded, surviving the end-Triassic extinction that saw the last of the Rauisuchian pseudosuchians and many of the more primitive reptile groups disappear, moving quietly through the undergrowth of a world that was about to become, unmistakably and dramatically, the dinosaurs' world. We tend to think of the natural world as we know it, the world of mammals and birds and flowering plants and coral reefs and grasslands and forests of oak and pine, as somehow the intended or permanent state of things, the baseline, the way things are supposed to be. But the story of life before dinosaurs makes clear that there is no such baseline. The natural world of any given moment is simply the current expression of a process that has been running continuously for billions of years, producing radically different results at different times, with no particular attachment to any of them. The Carboniferous forest was as natural as a modern temperate woodland. The Cambrian sea floor, carpeted with archaeochiathid reefs and wandering trilobites, was as natural as a modern coral reef. The oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Carboniferous was as natural as the atmosphere we breathe today. Each of these was a stable state, maintained by the collective activity of the organisms that inhabited it. shaped by the underlying geology and chemistry of the planet persisting until some perturbation, a shift in the orbit, a massive volcanic episode, the evolution of a new biological innovation that changed the rules, pushed it toward a different equilibrium. The diversity of life that existed before the dinosaurs was not simply a stepping stone toward the diversity we have today. It was a world complete in itself, intrinsically valuable, internally consistent, rich with complexity and interaction and evolutionary refinement. The giant insects of the Carboniferous were not practice runs for something better. They were solutions, fully operational, ecologically embedded, successful within their context. The fact that that context eventually changed does not diminish what they were. This perspective, understanding the living world as perpetually provisional, as a current state of a process that will continue producing new states long after anything human exists to observe them, is one of the genuine gifts of deep time study. It loosens the grip of any particular moment. It makes it easier to hold things lightly. The world before dinosaurs was immense and strange and full of life we can barely imagine. And it was real. It happened here, on this planet, under this same sun, turning in this same gravitational field. The rocks that formed in its seas are under our feet. The carbon that its forests sequestered is in our power plants. The oxygen its plants produced has been cycling through the atmosphere ever since, passed from organism to organism, breathed by creatures across hundreds of millions of years, inhaled right now by you. That continuity is worth sitting with for a moment. Among all the stories the fossil record tells, perhaps the most quietly remarkable are the stories of persistence. Not the dramatic explosions of diversity or the catastrophic extinctions, but the organisms that simply continued, through the Cambrian, through the Devonian, through the Permian, through the Cretaceous, through everything, arriving in the present day recognisably similar to what they were hundreds of millions of years ago. The horseshoe crab is perhaps the most famous example. Members of the horseshoe crab lineage have been present in the fossil record for roughly 450 million years, making them one of the oldest animal lineages still represented by living species. The horseshoe crabs on the beaches of Delaware Bay today are not identical to their Ordovician ancestors. Evolution does not produce exact repetition over such spans, but they are organised on the same fundamental body plan, using the same basic biology, occupying broadly similar ecological roles. The nautilus is another. The chambered nautilus with its coiled shell and its simple camera-type eye. A genuine pinhole camera, lacking a lens, achieving a modest but functional visual capacity through geometry alone, belongs to a lineage that was already ancient in the Paleozoic. The external shelled cephalopods that were the nautilus's ancestors were among the most abundant and diverse groups in the Paleozoic ocean, producing forms of extraordinary variety. Most of those forms are gone. The ammonites, those spectacularly diverse spiral-shelled cephalopods that filled the Mesozoic seas, disappeared in the end Cretaceous extinction. But the nautiluses survived, continuing into the present with their ancient eyes and their buoyancy chambers and their slow, patient navigation of the deep reef slopes where they spend most of their lives. The coelacanth, one of those lobe-finned fish whose broader lineage includes the ancestors of all tetrapods, was known from the fossil record until approximately 66 million years ago, at which point the fossil record appeared to go silent. Scientists assumed the coelacanth was extinct, another casualty of the end Cretaceous event. Then, in 1938, a South African museum curator named Marjorie Courtney Latimer noticed an unusual fish among the catch of a local trawler, and recognised it as something remarkable. It was a coelacanth, a living coelacanth, a fish of a lineage that had apparently survived undetected in the deep water off southern Africa for 66 million years. A second population was subsequently discovered in the waters of Sulawesi in Indonesia, thousands of kilometres from the first. These fish live at depths of 150 to 700 metres in cold water, largely hidden from shallow water fishing activity. They are not common animals. Population estimates for both known populations are disturbingly low. But they are present, and they are alive, and they are swimming through water with fins whose internal skeleton foreshadows, in its basic organisation, the arm bones of every tetrapod that ever lived. These survivors across deep time carry something with them that cannot be found in any fossil. They carry life itself, the irreducible, continuous thread of biological process that stretches back without interruption to the origin of their lineages. Every horseshoe crab on the beach, every nautilus in the deep reef, every coelacanth drifting through the cold, dark water, is the current end of a lineage that has been running continuously for hundreds of millions of years. Each one is a living connection to the ancient world. There is one more aspect of the Carboniferous world that deserves attention before we move toward the close of this journey, and it concerns the high oxygen levels we discussed early on, and a consequence of those levels that is both logical and striking. Fire. Modern fire requires three things: fuel, heat to ignite, and oxygen. Remove any one of them and the fire cannot sustain itself. In the modern atmosphere, at 21% oxygen, fire burns at a particular rate, hot enough to sustain itself if the fuel is dry enough and the ignition source adequate, but not so energetically as to spread uncontrollably through wet or green vegetation. Raise the oxygen concentration to 30% or more, and the physics of combustion changes significantly. Fires ignite more easily. The threshold of moisture content above which fuel will not burn drops considerably. Fires spread more quickly, burn hotter, and are more difficult to extinguish with the limited resources available in a natural setting. At oxygen levels high enough, even moderately wet vegetation can sustain a fire. The Carboniferous fossil record contains abundant evidence of ancient fire. Charcoal, fossilized wood burned in ancient fires, is found throughout Carboniferous coal deposits in quantities that indicate fire was a regular and widespread feature of Carboniferous ecosystems. The ancient charcoal, called fusane by paleobotanists, is sometimes found in such quantities that it constitutes a significant fraction of certain coal seams. These were not rare lightning strike events confined to unusually dry years. They appear to have been regular occurrences in the Carboniferous landscape. The fires would have been driven by lightning, the same mechanism that starts most natural fires today. But their behaviour in a high oxygen atmosphere would have been significantly more dramatic than what we observe in modern lightning strike fires. They would have spread faster, reached higher temperatures, and been more resistant to natural fire breaks such as wet soil or living vegetation. This creates an interesting paradox. The high oxygen atmosphere of the Carboniferous was, in a sense, self-limiting. The very conditions that drove oxygen levels upward, the accumulation of undecomposed plant material, also created the fuel for fires that consumed that material. The fires released the sequestered carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, which then drove plant growth, which produced more undecomposed material, which created more fuel for fire. The oxygen level fluctuated within this feedback system, cycling between values that were high enough to support giant insects and values that were somewhat lower, driven by the competing rates of carbon sequestration in undecomposed wood and carbon released through fire. The climate of the Carboniferous, viewed through this lens, was not a stable state but an ongoing oscillation, a complex system with multiple interacting feedbacks, perpetually seeking but never quite reaching an equilibrium. The giant insects, the enormous forests, the high oxygen atmosphere and the widespread fires were all part of the same system, all products of the same set of interacting processes. It is, in its way, a beautiful kind of complexity. Not simple, not linear, not heading anywhere in particular, just a vast, intricate, self-sustaining dance of physical and biological processes playing out across hundreds of millions of years. The end of the Permian, and with it the end of the Paleozoic era, was not a gentle transition. We have already described the scale of the end Permian extinction in terms of the species that were lost, but there is another way to appreciate what ended at that boundary. By thinking about what the world had taken nearly 300 million years to build and what it lost in what was, geologically speaking, a very brief interval. The trilobites, those ancient, elegant, visually sophisticated arthropods that had been present since the Cambrian, that had survived the end Ordovician extinction and the late Devonian extinction and every smaller perturbation in between, were gone. After nearly 270 million years of continuous existence, they disappeared from the fossil record at the Permian-Triassic boundary and never returned. The Eurypterids, those large, impressive sea scorpions that had been among the apex predators of the Silurian and Devonian seas, were gone. The rugose corals and tabulate corals that had built the complex reefs of the Paleozoic were gone, replaced in the Triassic and later periods by the scleractinian corals that build modern reefs, which belong to a completely separate evolutionary lineage. The productid brachiopods, one of the dominant shell-bearing organisms of Permian seas, enormously abundant and diverse, were gone. On land, the gorgonopsids, those sleek canine-toothed synapsid predators that had been the apex predators of the late Permian terrestrial world, were gone. The dicynodonts were nearly gone, reduced from an enormously diverse group to a small number of survivor lineages that would not recover their former diversity. The elaborate, diverse communities that the synapsids had built during the Permian were shattered. What remained was a world with a fraction of its former diversity, populated primarily by organisms that happened to have the right combination of characteristics for surviving the particular stresses of the end Permian event. And from that diminished starting point over the tens of millions of years of the Triassic, a new world was slowly assembled. It was the world that would produce the dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs would produce the birds, and in the shadow of the dinosaurs the small, warm-blooded, clever mammals that survived the end Cretaceous extinction would produce, after another 66 million years of evolution, a species that would one day look back at all of this with something very much like wonder. The night sky on a clear night shows you light that has travelled for years, for centuries, for thousands and millions of years to reach your eyes. When you look at a distant galaxy, you are seeing it not as it is but as it was, sometimes billions of years in the past. The universe you observe from any given moment is a collage of different times, a layered image built from light of wildly different ages arriving simultaneously at your retina. The fossil record offers something analogous. When you hold a trilobite in your hand, a small curled specimen perhaps, with the individual lenses of its compound eyes still faintly visible in the stone, you're holding an organism that lived 500 million years ago, not a representation of it, not a model or a reconstruction, the actual physical remains of the actual animal, the calcium carbonate of its lens, the chitin of its exoskeleton, mineralized but still in a chemical sense there. What it was made of has changed, but what it was, the shape it held in the world, the space it occupied, the life it lived, that is encoded in the stone. There is a kind of peace in that, in the knowledge that the world has been here so long, that it has seen so much, that it has repeatedly built and lost and rebuilt complexities that we can barely imagine. Whatever challenges the present moment holds, they are taking place against a background of immense, patient geological time, a background that has accommodated ice ages and mass extinctions, and the complete restructuring of the planetary surface, and that has always, eventually given rise to new complexity in the aftermath. The pre-dinosaur world, that long, strange, spectacular chapter of life's story, is not gone, not really. It is in the rock under our feet, and the coal in our history, and the oxygen in our blood, and the calcium in our bones, which is ultimately the same calcium that built the shells of organisms that have been dead for hundreds of millions of years. We are made of the ancient world, assembled from its leftovers, running on the chemical energy it stored. That continuity held gently in the mind is one of the more genuinely comforting thoughts available to a species that spends a great deal of time worrying about impermanence. The ancient world endures, not in the forms it took, which are gone, but in the matter it was made of, which is here, and in the processes it set in motion, which continue. Imagine a piece of Carboniferous limestone cut from a quarry somewhere in the American Midwest. It has been sitting in the earth for 300 million years. In that time, it has been buried under thousands of meters of subsequent sediment, compressed and slowly recrystallized, tilted by tectonic forces, and then gradually brought back toward the surface by the same slow erosion that exposes all rock eventually. When the quarry blast cracked it open, the first light in 300 million years fell on its surface. And there, in the fresh face of the stone, are trilobites. Several of them, caught in the act of living. One enrolled, curled into a protective ball as it was when it died. Their outlines are clear. The segmented thorax, the head shield with its half-moon eyes, the pointed tail. They were alive in a world that no longer exists. They breathed water in an ocean that's now dry land. They were part of an ecological community of extraordinary richness and complexity, embedded in a food web and a physical environment and a chemical atmosphere that the end Permian extinction erased more than 250 million years ago. And now they are here, on this table, in this light, seen by eyes that evolved from the descendants of tiny vertebrates that lived in the shadow of these organisms' world. The looking goes in both directions, across a gulf of time so immense that the word ancient is almost too small for it. This is the gift of paleontology. Not just knowledge, though the knowledge is extraordinary, but perspective. The ability to hold in the mind, even briefly, the full depth of the story that produced this moment. To understand that life is not a recent thing, not a fragile accident, not a thin coating on a rock. It is a 4 billion-year-old process, tested by everything the universe could throw at it, and still running. The era before dinosaurs was not a prelude. It was the world. It was life, in all its strangeness and abundance and complexity, doing what life does, filling every available space with organisms, building systems of extraordinary intricacy, running for hundreds of millions of years with a completeness and a richness that the subsequent eras would not surpass, only replace. It deserves to be remembered. It deserves the time it takes to truly imagine it. And in the imagining, in the quiet act of placing the mind, even approximately in a Carboniferous forest, or on the floor of a Cambrian sea, something opens, a sense of scale that daily life rarely offers, a sense of depth beneath the familiar surface of the world. The monsters of the ancient era are gone, their world is gone, but the rock remembers, and we, with our questions and our instruments and our extraordinary capacity for curiosity, are slowly learning to read what the rock has kept for us. The Devonian Sea was a different world from the Silurian one, warmer in many places, more stratified, with a marine fauna that had shifted significantly toward the vertebrate-dominated structure that we would recognise, if only distantly, in modern oceans. The fish of the Devonian were diverse and abundant. Ray-finned fish, the actinopterygians, ancestors of the vast majority of modern fish species, were present but not yet dominant. The seas were still partly defined by the placoderms and by various lineages of sharks, whose cartilaginous skeletons preserve less well than bone, and whose fossil record is therefore somewhat thinner than that of the bony fish, though shark teeth, dense and highly mineralizable, are found in abundance in Devonian formations worldwide. The Devonian is sometimes called the Age of Fish because the fish of this period were not merely abundant but genuinely transformative in their ecological role. The evolution of jaws, and then the diversification of jaw-bearing fish into a wide array of ecological niches, changed the structure of marine ecosystems in ways that were permanent. The ocean after jawed vertebrates was fundamentally different from the ocean before them. not just in the presence of large-bodied vertebrate predators, but in the behaviour of everything else, which now had to account for that predation pressure. Prey organisms that had not previously needed sophisticated detection and escape mechanisms now evolved them. Fish that already had relatively sophisticated nervous systems became the targets of selection for faster responses, better vision, more effective body mechanics for rapid acceleration. The Devonian was, in this sense, a kind of escalation, an acceleration of the evolutionary arms race between predators and prey in the marine environment, driven by the new capabilities that jaws and vertebrate physiology made possible. Meanwhile, on land, the Devonian forests were establishing themselves for the first time. The word forest may overstate the density and structure of these early assemblages. They were probably more open than any modern forest, with significant gaps between the trees and a ground layer that was not the lush, multi-layered understory of a mature Carboniferous swamp forest. But they were genuine forests, collections of woody plants, creating shade, altering the local climate, building soil, modifying the water cycle. And the animals that moved through the first forests were largely arthropods, mites, centipedes, early arachnids, the ancestors of the insects. Vertebrates had not yet established themselves on land, or were only just beginning to do so in the very latest Devonian. The first forests were arthropod worlds, as the Carboniferous forests that followed would also largely be, for all the drama of the giant forms we have discussed. And the arthropods that lived in those earliest forests were beginning an experiment in terrestrial living that would produce, over hundreds of millions of years, the most diverse class of organisms on the planet. Modern insects, beetles and flies and wasps and butterflies and moths and dragonflies and grasshoppers and ants and bees and beetles again, in their hundreds of thousands of described species and their millions of undescribed ones, are the culmination of that experiment. They are the living legacy of the first small arthropods that crept through the first sparse Devonian forests 400 million years ago. The night deepens. The story stretches back further than it is possible to fully hold in the mind at once. There is something gently remarkable about the fact that any of this is knowable at all. That rock, pressed together under the weight of subsequent sediment, has preserved the shape of animals that lived 500 million years ago. That the patient work of scientists, decades of field work in difficult places, careful laboratory analysis, the slow accumulation of a picture built from thousands of individual observations, has made it possible for us to sit here, in the present, and know what a Carboniferous forest looked like, what a Cambrian sea smelled like in chemical terms, what the oxygen content of the ancient atmosphere was doing over the course of millions of years. The people who do this work carry with them a relationship to time that is genuinely unusual among human experiences. A geologist walking across a landscape sees the rock differently from the way most people see it, not as inert background, but as record, as the compressed mineralized testimony of processes and organisms and environments that existed long before anything human walked the earth. The layers in a cliff face are chapters of a book, and a skilled reader can draw from them information about ancient climate, ancient sea level, ancient biology, ancient chemistry. This reading of the rock is one of humanity's more extraordinary achievements, not because of the technology it requires, though the technology is impressive, but because of the imaginative reach it demands. To look at a limestone cliff and see the Paleozoic sea floor, to hold a piece of coal and feel the weight of the Carboniferous forest, to find an ammonite in a ploughed field and know, immediately and viscerally, that you are holding something that lived in a warm sea when there were no flowers, no grasses, no birds, no mammals anywhere on Earth. That knowledge changes the way the present feels, not by making it seem small or insignificant, quite the opposite, by placing it within a story so long and so eventful that the present moment, for all its complexity and difficulty and beauty, becomes recognizable as part of something immense, something that has been building in all its improbable, contingent, continuously astonishing detail for longer than the mind can comfortably contain, The world before dinosaurs was real. Its creatures were real. Its forests and its seas and its impossibly alien skies were real. They existed, in all their strangeness, on this same planet, under this same sun, 300 million years before this moment, and somehow through all the extinction events and the continental collisions and the atmospheric revolutions and the slow grinding of geological time, the thread of life was never broken. It bent, it thinned. At the end of the Permian, it came closer to breaking than at any other time in the half-billion-year history of complex animal life. But it did not break. It continued. Through the bare, recovering Triassic world, through the rising diversity of the Jurassic, through the ecological elaboration of the Cretaceous, through the darkness that followed the end Cretaceous impact, through the long Cenozoic diversification of mammals and birds, through the ice ages of the Pleistocene, through the emergence of a primate with the unusual capacity to look backward across all of this and wonder. Here, at the end of this long journey, the wonder is what remains. Not the facts themselves, though the facts are extraordinary, but the feeling of them, the quiet, sustaining awareness that the world is deeper than it looks, that the ground under your feet is history compressed into stone, that the air you breathe is the product of billions of years of biological labour, that you're the current expression of a process that has been running since before the continents took their familiar shapes. The monsters of the ancient world are long gone. The forests that breathed out the oxygen they needed have been compressed into coal and carbon. The seas where the trilobites built their mineral eyes and the eurypterids hunted through the Silurian twilight are now mountain ranges and prairies and the floors of other younger oceans. But the story goes on. It has always gone on. It is going on right now, in the ordinary unremarkable miracle of living organisms metabolizing and reproducing and adapting and competing, and occasionally, in their billions of small accumulated decisions, reshaping the planet they live on. You are part of that story. You always were. And that perhaps is the most comfortable thought with which to end a journey through the ancient world. Not the strangeness of the past, though it is genuinely strange, but the continuity that runs through all of it and connects the Carboniferous millipede and the Cambrian sea and the Ediacaran mudflat to this exact moment, this breath, this quiet. The world before dinosaurs was remarkable, and the world it gave rise to in all its long unfolding is remarkable still. Rest now, in the deep time. It has been here a long while and it will be here a long while yet.